Making up this backpack is actually very simple. It's basically a little tote bag there with a flap with just some straps added to it. But there are some certain features which we'll actually we'll need to look at quite closely. We're going to make the straps up by putting a little bit of interfacing onto the back of our straps. If you can actually get a single line of fabric without a join in it, now that's great. But if you can't, you can't. As simple as that. Iron our interfacing on, then we're going to make a crease by folding the fabric widthways, and then we fold our raw edges into the center, and that creates our strip. We're going to do the same to our contrast as well. Very important to have it well ironed and so that it actually does stay flat and closed. Lots of steam, and then dry the seam out. Okay, so there are our two straps. Now we've also done the same process to our contrast. I'm just going to put a little bit of craft glue onto the seams, and so we're going to put the raw seam onto raw seam, centralize it, and just by adding a little bit of steam to that craft glue just sets it immediately. It's still repositionable. You can still pull it off if you need to there and fiddle around with it there, but it just helps it dry a little bit quicker. Saves using pins, saves using clips, and it keeps your stitching a little bit more even. So to the machine, once we're done both strips, I'm just using the edge of the inside of my foot to actually edge stitch the contrasting strap of fabric on top of the strip, the main bottom strip. So going through all layers, matching threads. The denim I've used has got lots of threads hanging off the edge. I'm trying to get rid of those as I'm sewing. Right, and then just stitch all the way through. Clip our ends off. There's our two lots of straps. From those we'll actually make some loops as well. So use the measurement in your notes. I think it's about 90 centimeters. We take off 10 centimeters or 4 inches for our loops. So we need to have 2 lots of loops for the top and 2 lots of loops for the bottom. Take a set of loops off each strap, otherwise you're going to have one very short strap. So we thread our sliding D-ring through onto our long strap first, just at one end. Just put a clip into that. It's about we want to turn over around about 1.5 inches. Then we want to actually make some loops up for the straps to actually go through that sit at the top and the bottom of the back of the backpack. Okay, so we end up with 4 loops and 2 straps. Okay, so the buckle ones go onto the straps, the ones that have the slide in the middle. So what we want to do is we want to just machine baste our D-rings onto our loops. And all I'm doing is actually using the width of my foot, which runs up the edge of the piece of metal inside the loop, and stitching them between the stitches on the contrasting fabric. Just back and forth, standard length, 2.5, and with matching thread top and bottom. Just take it slowly. Some machines like doing this, some machines don't. Just don't push it. Trim all our threads off. So with the strap, we need to actually do one more layer. So we need to turn. Okay, so that's threaded through the bar. Okay. Turn over 1/2 inch. And then, okay, see, 1/2 inch is turned over or turned under. And we're going to stitch that folded edge down. Now this is adding another layer, so don't go too fast. You've got to hold it and help it. Doesn't have to be right on the very, very edge. You could use your walking foot for this. Bear in mind, walking feet are not designed to go backwards. They will, but they're not designed to. So 6 rows of back and forth in there is enough to actually secure that quite okay. So there we go. All fingers and thumbs, there we go, feeding that through. That's how that works. Okay, that's how that works. There's more to this in the back of the notes as well when we come to finishing off. So we've got 4 loops and 2 lots of straps. Right, let's look at putting the tote or handbag together. So we've cut our lining out, so we want a matching lining to the square of the base section. So this is our base section. Let's mark our corners and also mark the midpoint on all these 4 sides of this base section. We want to find the midpoint. So we need to find the half. You can just fold it in half and make a mark. You don't have to use a tape measure. You can fold it in half if you wish. So we want the corners marked and we want the midpoints. So here I'm actually just going to mark my seam allowances. When I make a lining for a bag like this, I take just a little bit. So my seams are 1.5. That's what my standard seams are. Sorry, my seams are 1/2 inch. But I want to actually make this a little bit bigger. So I've made this 5/8 of an inch. So just to make them a little bit bigger. So that makes the lining sit a little bit smaller inside the handbag. So it's not quite so alive. Because sometimes if you make the lining the same size as the outside shell, you will find that they look too big and too bulky. Finding the midpoints is really, really important. So as I said, you could just fold it in half and mark it. Fold it in half and mark it. And we want to do these on all 4 sides because it's really, really important. Right, so the flap's already made because it's got the lining put on when we do it in the hoop. Here's our 2 side pockets for the sides of the handbag or the backpack. So 2 side pockets there, and then we have a centre pocket with a zip in it. There we go. That's how it looks. That's the front. And we've got our magnetic clasp, which matches our flap. And then we have our zip pocket at the top. So we want a pair of linings to cut for the sides. Okay, a pair of linings. And I've just put a strip of interfacing across the top of the lining through there. So it just supports the top edge of the backpack. So it makes that top edge a little bit firmer, which you want. Okay, so that's the top. So the interfacing strip, just 5-6 centimeters wide, so 2 inches, 2.5 inches wide, and just applied. So we want one piece of lining to go for the front. Now, because the front's got the zip on it, and we've got our flap there, because the front's got the zip on it, we've got a piece of strip of interfacing there. You don't have to have it there because you don't want to make it too thick, but I've put it in there. I like it. But for the back's got a pocket in the top of the lining. I haven't put the interfacing on that strip there because I think it might be too thick, because it's got to also sandwich that flap into position. Sorry, the flap has to be sandwiched into position as well. Oops, turn that flap over. Needs to go the other way. That's it. That's going to be sandwiched in between there. So that's going to be quite bulky, that seam, as it is. So adding a little bit of extra interfacing is probably not necessary on that lining piece. So that lining with that zip in the lining is the back panel. Alright, let's put our lining together, because I'm a firm believer that you actually start with your lining so as that you work out the method of actually construction with your lining rather than the outside shell. So we want to sew our seams, our side seams, onto our back panel, and then we add our extra front panel on the end. So it's just side seam, side seam, side seam. We wanted to create a box. So let's just put these together. Edges matching, edges matching, and it's a generous 1/2 inch seam, or as I said, a 1.5 seam or 5/8 seam, just to make that lining feel a little bit smaller inside the handbag, or side behind the backpack. And then we're going to open those seams up. Let's add our next panel to this. Move your zip into the middle. You saw me move the zip slightly. I don't want to be sewing over top of that zip tab. That will not be very good for anybody. This has got a perimeter seam around the edge of this panel there with some stitching, which we got out of the hoop when we were making the zip pocket. So that's a good guideline to sew by as well. So 5/8 seam. So taking 1/8 of an inch off 4 seams means that you've reduced your lining in width of 1/2 inch. That's just enough for it to actually slip inside the backpack easily and stay inside without it being too full looking or too big. Open these seams up. Plenty of steam. So side seam, side seam. Now the seam that we actually have a zip that comes through it, rather than pressing the zip back on itself to create extra bulk, just let the seam just twist to one direction below the zip. Okay, so that just allows that zip to sit flat. It's not bulky. See, I'll just twist that across. It's absolutely fine to do that when it comes to zips on linings and zips on the outside shells. Some people like to clip at either side of the zip, and I feel that that's probably a little bit, it takes a little bit of the strength away from that seam. Don't want to do that in a backpack. But letting that sit over to one direction so as the zip sits flat, that's ideal really. Just checking to make sure that I've got all my seams looking good. Okay, so that's what that's looking like inside there. So we've created a box. And now we want to add a base. Let's just clip these 4 midsections. This might look a little bit confusing to start off with there, but it's actually not. Now, let's start by putting the side seams. We want to make that, we want a center mark in that on the side panels. Seam on seam. Seam on seam, and then let's just snip the fold. That's the center of our 2 sides. Again, seam on seam. That's the center of our back panel. So we want side panel to narrow end of base panel. Let's put a pin in there so it's center on center. Center on center. And then we're going to stitch between the marked crosshairs on the corners. We'll have the base panel of the lining facing towards us, and we're going to stitch between cross point to cross point on all sections. But let's just do the ends first. Do that end, and then that end. And let's put that underneath the machine. Sit it so as that it's nice and flat, and that is sitting into place. And we're going to make sure that sits center to center, facing up, and we're going to stitch from point to point. Please back tack to the point. So start at the point, stitch 3 stitches forward, back tack 3 stitches, and do the same when you get to the other end. Again, same seam allowance that you've used for the other seams. First side done. Do the first side, second side, and then turn it through. And we're going to do the 2 long sides, which will be the front and the back. But what you've got to do first is you've got to clip the lining seam to the end of our stitching. Don't clip right to the stitching, just clip sort of like 3mm away or 1/8 of an inch away. Doesn't have to be right to the stitching. This is a lining, it will stretch. Doesn't matter if it's got a sharp corner in the corner of it, it's fine. Center to center. And start where you finished your stitching. Again, the same seam allowance you've used on all the other seams, and stitch from one side through the center, finishing on that corner point. There we have it. Okay, corner to corner. Let's just turn that through so you can have a look what it's doing. There we go. Corner to corner. That's great. So let's do the other side. Okay, so center to center. Then we need to clip. You'll be able to see that more. See, right, not quite to the stitching. Not quite to the stitching. Okay. That corner opens up, gives you a nice square. Pin and pin. Turn to the other side. We're going to sew across here. And we need to leave a gap of about about 5 inches. Just so as we can turn the work through once we've got it all sewn together. So we're just going to sew to just past that side seam. So we're going to stop and then leave a gap just past that seam, so where the seam allowance is. And that gap will allow us to turn the backpack through once we've completed it. There you go. There's a little hole there. Okay, so those points, that's where we're going to turn it through. Okay. That's what we've got there. There's our little letterbox. There's our lining made. We're going to do the same process for the outside shell. This time we're going to use the perimeter stitching as our guideline for our stitching. We're going to just be having our needle just inside the outer perimeter stitching line. So we're going to be sewing side panel to front. Okay. Bring that zip in, make sure you know where that zip tab is, then side panel to front. Again, following our stitching line, needle just inside the perimeter stitching. Okay, so we made sure we find our centre. We're going to do the same principle as we did with the base panel of our lining. But we want to actually just tack our loops, loops for the bottom of our backpack into place. So I've just put them either side of that open seam allowance. So I've opened those seams up, I've pressed them already. And then I want to find the center. This is the back panel here. I want to find the center, and I want to put my pair of other loops side by side in the center. Now, because they've got a little bit of a overhang with the D-ring, there has to be like a 1/4 of an inch gap in between those two loops. They can't be buttoned up together, unfortunately. So just leave a 1/4 inch of a gap either side of that centre line. And we're going to just machine base those into position, and that will stop them from moving when we attach our lining and attach our flap, because we don't want them moving around. Just go slowly, going through thicknesses. A jeans 16/100 needle there can be a help to you. You can go a little bit heavier if you want. You could go a 18/110 if you wish. Just depends on how your machine is coping with the bulk. Just stitch slowly. There's nothing wrong with stitching slowly. There we go. There's our loops attached. Let's put our front on. Again, same position. Using stitching inside the 1/2 inch seam allowance perimeter line. It doesn't actually take long to put this little backpack together. You don't actually have to have the back straps on it if you don't want to. I mean, you could just put a top handle on it. It could be physically a little lunch pail type bag. It doesn't have to be a backpack. It is very cute though. Right, so that's what we have. Press those seams open and let's start putting our base on. So again, centre to centre mark, we're going to do the side panels to the end of the base panel. Again, stitching to the corner marks, which we will have marked with the machine perimeter stitching when we were doing our embroidery. Very easy to see on this. Okay, so there's one end. Okay, let's do the other end. Centre on centre. Please, by all means, use pins or clips to actually get these all lined up. I mean, I trained as a professional machinist there, so I don't use pins that much when I sew, and I just wanted to actually get this up and running for you so you can see this. But all the potentials there. We are clipping into that stitching point. Okay, not going up to the last stitch. We're just hanging back a little bit shy, like 1/8 of an inch. 2-3 millimeters. Okay, so there we have it. Now, those side seams. Those side seams are done. Now we want to do the front seam and the back seam. We have extra bulk because we've got 2 layers of bag, and we also have those loops. So just bear in mind that we have got a little bit of extra thickness yet again. So longer stitch, heavier needle, stitch slowly when it comes to going over the bulk. Okay, so I'm stitching a little bit more slowly. Once I'm over that, I'll be fine. You can tell where I'm not on bulk. There we are, we're going over that loop, you can tell. Back. There we go, there's one. And we're going to do the other side as well. This seam doesn't have any loops in it, so it's a little bit quicker. Okay, so just want to, there's our corners, they look all great, but to make them even sharper, we probably should cut our corners off slightly. Not all the way to the stitching, just cut some of the bulk off those corners by snipping across the edge. This method is called sewing to the net. It means that we actually don't pivot around our corners. We're basically sewing up to a point. Okay, so just snip. That's what I've done with those corners. Yep. So you don't want to be close to the stitching. You want to be a little bit further away. But just take some of the bulk out, and that will give you a sharper corner when you turn it through. Just wriggle those corners out. Oh, it's getting exciting. We're almost there. So, I usually press those seams quite flat so as they stand up. We want to add a little handle, which is about, I think it's about 20 centimeters I've suggested as being our length. And I've just butted the edge of the handle up to the satin stitch pattern in the seam allowance, just so as it doesn't go over the satin stitch. Just going to actually base that into position with the machine. It can be closer, it can be longer, it can be shorter, it's up to you. I'm just putting the handle on there, bearing in mind I've got 2 loops that are going to be sitting in the middle of this, on this seam, because this is going on to the back. Okay, so that's machined into position. And then we want to put those face down, find our center point, because that's going to end up center point of our flap, center point of our where our 2 little loops are. Make sure those loops sit flat, because you don't want the buckle turning up into your seam allowance and trying to stitch over it. It will not be a happy result for anybody. Put a clip in there. Keep it nice and flat. Now stitch slowly. Now this is sped up motion, and it looks like I'm stitching really slowly because I am. I'm going on over all those central loops, plus I've got a flap and I've got the back of the backpack. Oh, it's starting to look real. Just giving it a squeeze just to make sure it sits right. Right. There we go. Ready for our lining. Let's just, our lining's inside out. Let's just put our outside shell into the lining. Make sure you tuck that flap down. And we're going to clip seam on seam on seam. Add more clips, add more pins, do whatever you need to. Now you'll find that the lining feels a bit tight when you're sewing this. Just pull it, give it a stretch, and it will be fine. Don't clip it, but it will keep it all together. And you want that firmness, otherwise you're going to have a bit of a fluty top of your backpack when you turn it through. It's going to look a bit fluted or a little bit wavy. Having the lining a little bit tighter keeps that very, very straight. So I am using my embroidery perimeter line, stitching just inside that, so it's going to be a generous 1/2 inch seam, and I'm just taking it slowly around the areas that I've got huge bulk. Once you've completed the seam, you can go over it again, stitch it twice if you wish, if you want it to be really, really rigid. Well, not really rigid, but really secure. Very hard to keep this seam looking very, very straight because it's quite controlling against the machine, but it does not matter once it's turned through. You don't see that seam there. It makes no difference to the outside, unless you've got great big steps within your seam. I always ensure that my needle was sitting down into my fabric once I stop sewing and try to reposition. I'm just checking to see where those loops have gone. I don't want them to appear anywhere. I may have lost a clip in there. That's what I was going to fish for. Going slowly, so I'm coming over to bulk, obviously. Yeah, that will be that back panel. The interfacing around the top of the lining means that when you turn it through, the lining sits down into the backpack quite nicely, quite nice and flush and flat. Right, there we have it. Let's turn it inside out. And just be a bit gentle. You've got quite a lot coming through that little hole. They refer to this as birthing the bag. Okay. So before we turn it through, I just want to just machine that opening. Just fold your seams in, machine that opening closed, just with a straight stitch on the edge. So I'm just going to machine that closed. Again, please pin the clip. Right, put the lining into the bag. Looks great. Press that round, and then from the outside, I just roll that front lining up a little bit and make a fake piping. So we're just stitching in the ditch on the edge of the top lining from the flap to flap. So across the sides, across the front, across the other side, back to the flap. Don't go through all layers, it's too thick. So it gives you a fake piping look, and having that interfacing on the top of that lining definitely helps this look appear. Look how flat and straight that is. I don't really want to top stitch it because where do I start and finish, and I don't want to top stitch all the way around. If you've got a walking foot machine or industrial, by all means do that. I just think that I'm asking a bit much having all those layers and the loops, etc. So you can see that little edge there just sticking out. Let me put that back on. And there we have. Then we want to thread our straps on, follow the diagram in the notes, and then we want to actually attach those straps in the same way that we attach the loops. It's a cute little backpack. It's been a real pleasure to make.